The pastor called me up a little while ago, and he said, we'd like to do some brief talks from church members on things that we deal with in life as a part of this series. And he was gracious enough to say, you know, your schedule is probably a pretty hectic one. I'll give you first dibs. Now, I could have picked the first night or the last night, but I decided to do the first night. And my good friend Robert Brock, who will be doing one of these talks, our CFO at Metroplex, he made me promise today. He said, don't set the bar too high, okay? I'm following you. Well, Robert knows me a little better than that, and he saw my slides or got a glimpse of them. He said, okay, I'm working on mine too. But tonight we will speak about conflict management, and these are just a few thoughts that hopefully will stimulate your approach to conflict when you face it in life. One of my favorite authors, Max Lucado, said, conflict is inevitable, but combat is optional. And this is also biblical, by the way, because even in Isaiah, what do you think reasoning is? Come now and let us reason together. There are not too many of us when we sit down to reason, because if you look at dictionary.com, the definition of reason is to think, to offer opinions and judgments in a logical way about a particular topic. And most of us have our opinions about things. So when we reason, sometimes it results in conflict. And the reality is that the primary source of conflict is, have any idea? You're close. How about poor communication? That's a synonym for miscommunication. That's the primary reason that we experience conflict. I've been married for almost 30 years, and I've known her for 37 years to my amazing wife. And every time we have conflict, and yes, we have conflict, and yes, we do fight. I'm not going to stand up in front of you and tell you how wonderful everything is. But whenever we do, somewhere in there, what I hear is, you were not communicating very clearly with me. And my response is, you weren't paying attention. And it goes back and forth. Usually it goes the other way. But poor communication. And what do you think the key is to effective communication? Oh, you're an awesome class. Listening. My question to us this evening is, how many of us are good listeners? It's interesting that, you know, there's a brave man. Can I speak to you afterwards, please? But it's interesting, whenever that question is asked, we are always a little hesitant to raise our hands and how good we are as listeners. And then we wonder why we have so much conflict. When we're acknowledging, unless you're not telling the truth, that we're not very good at the key element of communication. The reality is, and every time I see this from a bit of research that was done, especially when I'm talking, I have to remind myself that 7% of what I'm communicating is coming from these words. 93% of it is nonverbal. My body language, my tone. And again, just picking on my wife, whenever we have conflict, it's like, I just said something. She said, you didn't hear the tone that you said that with. I'm like, what tone? I am totally oblivious to the fact that there was some edge in what I said that absolutely ticked her off and started the conflict. So, let's test how good we are as listeners. Okay? Johnny's mother has 3 children. The first child's name is Dime. The second child's name is Nickel. What's the third child's name? How many of you thought Penny? Fess up now. Fess up. Thank you. The reality is this exercise was first given to a group of Fortune 100 executives. 97 of them, these are people who run the biggest companies in the world. 97 of them said the third child's name is Penny. And the way it was done is they were invited in front of their colleagues, and the facilitator, he was manipulating 3 coins. And he looked at them and he said, Johnny's mother has 3 children. The first child's name is Dime. He showed them a dime. The second child's name is Nickel. He showed them a nickel. And the third child's name is, and 97 of them said Penny. And they all acknowledged to being great listeners. So, my wife, who heard that before, don't think she's that great a listener. The third child's name is Johnny. And the reality is, one of my favorite quotes from Scott Peck says, love is work. The greatest work of love is attention, and the greatest work of attention is listening. It's one of the greatest gifts we can give each other as we deal with conflict. So, briefly, Thomas and Killeen, they're considered one of the authorities on conflict management. They identified 5 conflict management styles, and I'll touch them very briefly. The first one is accommodating. And it requires a high degree of cooperation. The focus is on preserving relationships. And it's okay, and I put in quotes, if you lose. But the key here is you want to preserve the relationship. So you seek to be accommodating. And then the other one is avoiding. And many of us are good at this one, right? Emotionally, when the atmosphere is emotionally charged, it's a good thing to avoid conflict. When I see fire in my wife's eyes, and Phyllis knows that look, okay? When I see fire in my wife's eyes, it's a good time to avoid any conflict. When the fire has been doused, we can talk about it. Also, if the matter is trivial, why make a big deal about a trivial issue? You avoid conflict when you think you're not going to win. And this one, I always love it when people say, when they're faced with conflict, oh, this will resolve itself. Nothing ever resolves itself. It may come back at you 20 years later. It does not resolve itself. Don't avoid it. And it's never good for the long term. Short term, you may be able to avoid the conflict. But for the long term, deal with it. And then collaborating. And it's probably my preferred approach. It focuses on win-win, requires, however, a high degree of trust. And the reason we don't like to do this is because it requires time and effort and energy to get those that you have the conflict with to quote-unquote come around. And then competing. And this one, I always smile when people say, we're having healthy competition. Now, there's an oxymoron, okay? Because when you're competing, you're focusing on somebody being a winner and somebody being a loser. And it's all about you and your goals. Also, there are times, however, when competing is important, when decisive action is necessary. Somebody has to make the decision, do it, even if it creates conflict. And your hope is that the approach is supported, if not immediately, at least eventually. And then compromising. And this is one we don't like to use that word, because it sounds like what? You're giving in, right? No. It's not always lose-lose, and it does not have to be the easy way out. It's about being moderately assertive and cooperating with the person you have the conflict with. The reality is that conflict will happen, and how you respond to and resolve conflict will limit or enable your success as an individual. I've seen that throughout my professional and my personal career. I love, however, the way that it is stated in the message in Philippians. And this was Paul writing to a Gentile church that he loved, but there was a conflict between 2 sisters in this church, if you read in Philippians 4. And Eugene Peterson puts it in this beautiful language. It says, if you've gotten anything at all out of following Christ, if his love has made any difference in your life, if being in a community of spirit means anything to you, if you have a heart, if you care, then do me a favor. Agree with each other. Love each other. Be deep-spirited friends. Don't push your way to the front. Don't sweet-talk your way to the top. Put yourself aside and help others get ahead. Don't be obsessed with getting your own advantage. Forget yourselves long enough to lend a helping hand. The reality is, if we seek to live by this, all of that theory I shared with you earlier, this sums it up beautifully, and it will help us to not avoid, but deal with conflict appropriately. So embrace conflict as a source of growth and transformation in your life. The pastor will answer all questions afterwards.